Okay, so we're going to move on to chapter 22, the origin of species, and we're going to cover sections 1 and 2 within this chapter, leaving out the rest of those sections, but there's a lot of information within these two sections of chapter 22. So if you remember this guy, Charles Darwin, who is kind of the grandfather of speciation and evolution, he took a trip to the Galapagos Islands, which is still around, and on the Galapagos Islands, there are very isolated populations that you don't necessarily find associated with the mainland or even similar to those on the mainland. And while he was there, he discovered hundreds of new plants and animals that were found nowhere else on Earth, and he was able to compare those to things that exist on other parts of the world. And from that information, he was able to figure out how things might have evolved and what would have been the benefit of evolving different beaks in certain birds or different heights in certain plants or different colors in certain fish. So I would understand the definition of speciation, which is the process by which one species splits into two or more. And so we were talking about this a lot when we looked at phylogenetic trees. There was that main ancestor, and from that main ancestor would split off two different species, right? Speciation explains the features shared between organisms due to inheritance from their recent common ancestor. So when we remember back to humans, Homo sapiens, we share a common ancestor with Neanderthals. Well, we resemble them in some way, although we're not identical to them. We share common features, and that's due to a common ancestor. So speciation forms a conceptual bridge between microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is kind of what we've been looking at, which consists of changes in an allele frequency in a population over time. And so a good example would be changes in different species of canines. So you have wolves, you have coyotes, you have domestic dogs, foxes, and I don't know what the third dog in there is supposed to be, but they're all related to a common ancestor. They share common features. That would be microevolution, where they look very similar to one another. Macroevolution refers to broad patterns of evolutionary change way above the species level. So this is how prokaryotes and eukaryotes branched off from one another, how fish evolved from a common ancestor that was related to jellyfish. This is like over a long, long, long period of time compared to microevolution. So species is a Latin word that means kind or appearance, right? And we're going to really delve into this idea of the biological species concept and how it it defines a species based on those individuals being reproductively isolated, separated from one another. So biologists compare morphology, which is how you look, physiology, which is kind of what's going on inside, biochemistry, also going on inside, and DNA sequences when they group organisms together. And specifically, that biological species concept looks at how you can reproduce with one another or can't in order to make different species. Biological species concept states that species is a group of populations whose members have the potential to breed with one another in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring. They do not breed successfully with other populations. So biological species concept is all about being able to mate and produce viable offspring. Gene flow between populations holds the populations together genetically. So there's genetic flow between different populations making a species. Or for instance, there is a gene flow between packs of wolves. Maybe they'll go outside of their pack and breed with one another, but they maintain that they're the same species. And so the biological species concept allows that there will be similarities between different species, although they may not be able to mate with one another for reasons that we'll get into. And there also can be diversity within species. So just looking at humans, we're all extremely diverse. If you look around, not one person looks identical to the other except in the case of twins. And yet we're able to breed among one another and produce viable, fertile offspring. Reproductive isolation is the existence of biological barriers that impede two species from producing viable fertile offspring. So there is some barrier that doesn't allow you to produce offspring that are fertile. We'll get more into depth with this, but an example would be that the individuals don't live in the same continent, so those populations are never going to be able to interbreed. It could be that their genitalia don't fit together properly. So it's some barrier that impedes two species from producing viable fertile offspring. Sometimes, if they are in the same space and time, they can produce a hybrid, which is a cross between two different species. Lion and a tiger could make a hybrid. However, they usually cannot, those hybrids cannot then reproduce and make offspring, so they're not fertile. Reproductive barriers can be classified whether they act before or after fertilization. If it happens before fertilization, we call it prezygotic, pre meaning before, right? Prezygotic barrier. It keeps fertilization from occurring. So they can't mate for whatever reason. Something prevents them. Maybe they try the act of mating, but something prevents a successful completion of mating, or hindering fertilization if mating is successful. So there are three types of prezygotic barriers that you want to know. Prezygotic barriers are things that separate species based on the biological species concept. And examples of those would be habitat isolation. So they're located on, they might be able to mate if you stuck them together, but they're located in different areas. They don't overlap. Temporal isolation, which would be like time-wise, season-wise. We'll get into that with these skunks. Or behavioral isolation, something in the behavior of mating stops the mating from actually occurring. So all these prezygotic barriers prevent any type of mating from actually happening. Habitat isolation would be where two species encounter each other rarely or never because they occupy different habitats, even though they're not necessarily isolated by a physical barrier. So there's not like a mountain or a canyon that prevents these two snakes from overlapping. It's just that one is found on land, it's terrestrial, and the other, these are little garter snakes. The other one is found in an aquatic environment. And so they're not going to encounter one another because one avoids the water and one avoids the land. If you stuck them together and forced them to mate, they probably could. But this habitat isolation, they're located in different habitats, and so they're not going to encounter one another in order to produce viable offspring. The best example of temporal isolation would be species that breed at different times of the day or during different seasons or different years, and so they just can't mix their gametes because they're not in reproductive mode. So the best example are these spotted eastern and western spotted skunks. While they overlap, their habitats do overlap. The eastern mates in the late winter and the western only mates in the late summer. So if you think about dogs or cats, when they go into heat, there's only certain times when that female can accept a male and actually mate with the male, where she will have an egg that will be fertilized by the sperm. And since they mate at different times, their body goes into heat at different times, they're not going to be able to mate with one another, and so they're considered separate species. Behavioral isolation is related to courtship rituals and other behaviors. So one example are these blue-footed, they're a little bird called a blue-footed booby, and different species of these birds have specific courtship behaviors, and if they don't do exactly what they know that their mate should do, they're not going to mate with one another. So this one would be probably one of the more rare things, temporal isolation also being a little bit rare, but habitat isolation being the more common of the prezygotic barriers. There's also mechanical isolation and gametic isolation. So in these situations, temporal, habitat, and behavioral, mating can't even happen. They can't even attempt to mate. In mechanical isolation and gametic isolation, they can attempt to mate, it just doesn't work, and they can actually mate, but no fertilization happens. So mechanical isolation, mating was attempted, but couldn't go through with act. Gametic isolation, mating occurred, but nothing was fertilized. So still pre-zygotic barriers because no zygote. Zygote being when an egg and a sperm fuse together, they produce a zygote, right? If the zygote's not made, then it's a pre-zygotic barrier. Mechanical isolation would be some morphological difference that prevents them from mating with one another. So it's not a lock and key mechanism. They don't fit together for whatever reason. These snails kind of exhibit that. They'll try to mate with one another, but they don't fit together properly, and so they can't actually complete the act of mating. Sperm cannot be received by the egg. Gametic isolation is where the sperm of one species may not be able to fertilize the egg of another species. They're able to mate with one another, but the sperm can't do it, can't do the job because the egg will not accept it. Postzygotic barriers are those that prevent the zygote from developing into a viable or fertile adult. And so you've got two species that produce a hybrid, cannot become a viable fertile adult because either the hybrid doesn't make it to adulthood, the hybrid isn't fertile, or there's some sort of breakdown and it's just kind of a dwarfed, kind of mutated, deformed almost, kind of a hybrid. So these are postzygotic barriers, things that happen. A zygote is produced, they're able to mate, they're able to fertilize the egg, they're able to produce an offspring, but either you get reduced hybrid viability. So with these lizards, if you get a hybrid, you just don't get offspring. Reduced hybrid fertility, best example is the mule. Donkey and a horse mate, they produce a mule, but mules are sterile in most cases. There have been some cases where they are not. Or there's hybrid breakdown, like with this, whatever plant this is, wheat or whatnot. The hybrid, is in the middle and it's just a teeny tiny plant that really isn't going to produce much offspring itself. So reduced hybrid viability, genes of different parent species, so genes of two different species may interact and impair the hybrid's development or survival. So for whatever reason, when these two species mate, they produce an offspring that just can't survive in the environment that it's in. So it's probably not going to make it to adulthood or to sexual maturity to produce offspring. Reduced hybrid fertility, even if the hybrids are vigorous, they may be sterile. So a mule used a lot in warm states, especially in the United States, as a workhorse or a work mule because they can tolerate, they have certain characteristics about them that are beneficial for the heat. They can tolerate heat, they can carry long loads. So they kind of gain the best of both worlds from the parent donkey and the parent horse, but mules usually cannot mate with one another to produce viable offspring. It has happened before. It has happened before, but that was extremely rare cases. And also, it didn't really happen in nature. It was in a closed system, experimental, if you will. Another example of reduced hybrid fertility would be lions and tigers. They can reproduce, but they produce that, I think they call it a liger, and they are not able to reproduce after that. Hybrid breakdown. So some first generation hybrids are fertile, but when they mate with other species or with their parent species, and the offspring becomes sterile or they're feeble or they, so as future generations of these hybrids develop, they eventually wane out because they're unable to survive. That's hybrid breakdown. So we've got 5 different types of prezygotic barriers. 3 of them don't allow mating to happen. 2 of them allow mating, but they don't allow fertilization to occur. And then postzygotic barriers are where mating occurs, fertilization occurs, but viable fertile offspring are not possible. And so all of these things would separate these 2 species from one another. There are some limitations of biological species concept, one being that it only works for those organisms that are sexual organisms, so it's not going to include asexual things that are able to reproduce without a male or female. They just make clones of one another. It also emphasizes the absence of gene flow. However, gene flow can occur between distinct species. For example, grizzly bears and polar bears can mate to produce these growler bears, and that growler bear is able to produce viable offspring, but you're talking about kind of a physical barrier that keeps them apart. They just don't do it, but they do produce a viable offspring that can reproduce. Okay. So because biological species concept isn't great for everything, like for instance, it also doesn't work well with things that aren't alive anymore, right? You can't deter anything from biological species concept from fossils. So there are other concepts of species that are used in order to group things together when situations with biological species concept can't be utilized. One would be morphological species concept, and this defines species by structural features. So this could be, we could apply this to sexual and asexual species. It doesn't look at genetic flow. It could also potentially be utilized with fossil records. Ecological species concept views a species in terms of its ecological niche, and it applies to both sexual and asexual species and emphasizes the role of disruptive selection. The phylogenetic species concept defines a species as the smallest group of individuals that share a common ancestor. So they have a single branch on the phylogenetic tree. And we use this species concept a lot with biological species concept. You would think it would be easy to define a species, but in reality it's not because there's so many exceptions to the rule. Phylogenetic species concept does apply to sexual and asexual species, but it can be difficult to determine the degree of difference required for separate species. So speciation, or the separation of two different species, can take place with or without geographical separation. Two different species arise in two different ways: allopatric speciation or sympatric speciation. So in the example of these fish, you have kind of a tide pool with a bunch of fish in it. Say that the water lowers, you're in a drought, the water lowers, and this, an example on the left, now you have a geographical barrier and these fish are trapped on one side or the other and over time eventually develop into two different species. So allopatric means that there is a physical barrier that prevents them from reaching the other population. Sympatric speciation is devoid of a physical barrier. It just means that something occurred that without something separating them physically, they developed into two different species. So allopatric speciation, gene flow is interrupted when a population is divided into geographically isolated subpopulations. There's an earthquake and there's a huge canyon that's formed, and now two species of deer can't reach one another, and so over time eventually those two species, because the genetic flow is not occurring between the two, may turn into two different species. The definition of geographic barrier depends on the ability of the population to disperse. So while that canyon might have created a barrier for the deer and the rodents, it may not necessarily create a physical barrier for birds that can fly over it, maybe for pollen in trees that can be blown by the wind, or other animals that are a coyote or a fox or something else that's able to scurry up and down those areas or travel far enough that they can go around it to continue to reach the other population. Separate populations may evolve independently through mutation, natural selection, and genetic drift. Reproductive isolation might arise as a result of genetic divergence. For example, with the mosquito fish in the Bahamas, there's different isolated populations in different ponds. And in certain ponds where predation rates are really high, these fish have evolved different body shapes that are different than the low predation ponds. So they're able to get away from predators. So that would be an example of natural selection that acted on these separate populations, making them become two different species over time. Maybe the development of a body that's able to rapidly get away from prey has also changed its body shape in a way that it can't physically mate with the other species. So some of the evidence that allopatric speciation is occurring: reproductive barriers can be developed in lab populations that are experimentally isolated and subjected to different environmental conditions. And usually when we do reproductive experiments in the lab, you're using animals that reproduce very quickly. Otherwise, if you were doing it with dogs, one person in their lifetime might not be able to see evolution actually occurring. But when you use animals that reproduce at a very fast rate, like once a month, produce offspring often, then you're probably going and reach sexual maturity very fast, then you're going to be able to see evolution occurring a lot quicker. So there's an example with fruit flies that are raised on different diets. Well, fruit flies from egg to mature adult is going to take 2 weeks or less. And so you're able to see multiple generations, hundreds of generations potentially within a year. So you raise them on different diets and they evolve to digest their food more effectively and efficiently. And then they have a preference to mate with partners that have adapted the same food source. They actually will avoid. So if some of the flies are raised on starch medium, their gut starts to change to digest that starch better. And if they're mixed in with a population of flies that are raised on maltose, which is a sugar medium, they'll avoid those and mate with only with those that, for whatever reason, nature has allowed them the ability to know that these guys can digest starch like they can better. So they avoid those that they know aren't going to survive, instead choosing one that they do believe is going to survive, which of course will allow them to have offspring that hopefully will survive. Allopatric speciation has also been observed in nature. One example is with these little snapping shrimp. So they diverged a long, long time ago, 9 to 3 million years ago, because they became isolated by the Isthmus of Panama. And so what occurred was that we ended up with 4 different species of, of shrimp because a physical barrier separated them. Regions with many geographical barriers typically have more species than regions with fewer barriers. And that's another way that we've been able to prove that allopatric speciation occurs. Reproductive isolation between populations generally increases as the geographic distance between them increases. So the more the geographic distance is, the harder it is for them to reach one another, and so usually isolation is going to increase also. Reproductive isolation is the result of intrinsic barriers or natural barriers. Physical separation is not a biological barrier. So just because they choose to separate themselves from one another, it's the result of some physical thing. Intrinsic barrier. Sympatric speciation, sympatric actually means same country. And so this is speciation that takes place in populations that live in the same geographic area. A choice was made at some point that they evolved 2 different species. They started mating with certain mates, avoiding others, and 2 species arose. Sympatric speciation occurs when the gene flow is reduced between groups that remain in contact through factors. And this can be polyploidy, habitat differentiation, or sexual selection. So polyploidy is the presence of extra sets of chromosomes due to mutations and things that go wrong during cell division. It's a lot more common in plants than it is in animal because in most cases polyploidy is detrimental to us. So like the quintessential example having an extra chromosome set would be Down syndrome. Nowadays it's not as detrimental, but back 100 years ago, 50 years ago, those individuals usually didn't live as long as those that didn't have Down syndrome, etc., etc. Autaploidy is an individual with more than 2 chromosome sets derived from one species. The offspring of mating between autaploids and diploids have a reduced fertility. So let's look at this really quick. So in this, just so you kind of get an idea of having double of what you need. So this is what you should look like. This is what mom looks like. Cell division occurs, And instead of these chromosomes splitting, they just doubled. So you ended up with a tetraploid. Well, when this guy goes through meiosis and separates, he looks just like, each gamete looks like what the whole mother looked like. And so you end up with a new species in the end because you've got way too many chromosomes. And with an animal, that normally is detrimental, but with plants, it can occur. An alloploid is a species with multiple sets of chromosomes derived from different species. So alloploids can successfully mate with each other, but they can't interbreed with the parent species. And so then they make their own, so that a hybrid is formed basically, and the hybrids breed with one another, producing a new species. Autoploidy is where the offspring and the parent population can continue to reproduce, but they have really reduced fertility. A lot of our crops are polyploids, and plant geneticists produce these new polyploid species using chemicals to induce errors in cell division. They're able to enhance things that we need. And so it's when you hear about genetically modified plants or organisms, this would be an example. Genetically modified doesn't necessarily have to be a negative thing. Without genetically modifying certain things, we wouldn't have as much cotton and potatoes, tobacco, wheat products, and all those things that we require to feed all of us here on the earth. Sympatric speciation can also result from the appearance of new ecological niches. So there's a maggot fly in North America that can live on its native hawthorn trees. And then when apple trees were introduced to North America, they started to move over and feed on these apple trees. Well, the flies don't really fly around very much. Even as adults, they pretty much stick to their host plant. And so as they started to utilize different host species, they started to reproductively isolate themselves. And by both habitat and temporal barriers, because the hawthorn produced a berry at a different time that the apple trees did, and of course it's the larva or the maggot, the young of the fly, that has to feed on that. And so they started to differentiate themselves and basically produce two different species, when at one time it was one. Sexual selection is another thing that can drive sympatric speciation. So a good example of this is mates of different colors. So there's these cichlid fish in Lake Victoria, and the mates must have started to have an attraction to specific colors, and that likely contributed to all these different separate species of cichlids that you have in Lake Victoria. It started to evolve and look very different from one another. So sexual selection is where you choose something specific in a mate, and then your offspring also choose the same thing in a mate, and pretty soon you separate yourself out as a different species. So to review allopatric and sympatric speciation, allopatric speciation involves geographic isolation that restricts the flow of genes between populations. So there's some geographic barrier that prevents you from mating with someone else. Intrinsic or natural barriers to reproduction may then arise by natural selection, genetic drift, or sexual selection in isolated populations. Even if contact is restored between those populations, interbreeding is prevented by reproductive barriers. Even if that canyon closes back up together again, those deer maybe aren't able to reproduce with one another because now there's some sort of physical barrier, body-wise, morphological barrier that prevents them from doing it. In sympatric speciation, a reproductive barrier isolates a subset of a population without geographic separation from the parent species. Sympatric, you're in the same place. Just something else has made you decide not to mate with someone else. So it could be polyploidy, wrong, going through cell division incorrectly to produce more chromosomes, so now you're genetically different. Could be natural selection, like in the case of the fly maggots, they are looking at feeding on different types of plants and separating themselves from one another, or it could be sexual selection. You choose a specific mate based on something that it looks like and start to only mate with those like it and produce different offspring, like in the case of the cichlids of Africa. So after you've listened to this lecture, I would now, if you haven't read the chapter, make sure you do read the chapter, and then I would do the dynamic study module, follow that up with the homework or the chapter 22 assignment, and then finish that up with the quiz. I wouldn't go out of order because the dynamic study module, homework, and then quiz order allows you to get a better grade on your quiz. Homeworks and dynamic study modules help you grasp the material better because they're meant to be tutorial and activity driven and kind of self-guided.